First of all, thank you all again very much, John Noble and the musicians that were here with us tonight. Wonderful job. And first, I just want to specify that what they're going to see at the Duke is much more, much larger, much bigger. And one of the aspects that impressed me the most, immediately after John Noble's interpretation of Toscanini, I have to say, is the background, the footage, the images that are projected in a magnificent way that really interacts with the story. So maybe Don wants to tell us something about that component of the performance that contributes to create such a grand atmosphere in what is still a relatively small theater.
Yes, the projections are done by David Bengali, and he is part of the artistic team that Eve has put together, which consists of Eve and Max Barros and James Mello, who are not here tonight, and myself as director of theatrical production, Vanessa James, who does the sets and costumes, and Beverly Emmons, who does the lighting, and then David is the projectionist. And if you haven't seen an ERC production, I'm fond of saying there's really nothing like ERC. It is a total, people used to say multimedia, etc. We're very proud of having put together the wonderful music with the wonderful writing and collection and kind of collaging. All the words that John said tonight were actually written. Those are real words. They're not made up, and that gives a very important tone to an ERC production. The projections that Stefano is talking about give us a whole other dimension of visions of New York City, of surrealist painting that was happening at the same time as Toscanini, etc. And so the idea, we want to use every single kind of device to make the audience feel and to wrap you into the world of whoever is the lead character or whatever the theme is of ERC, and the projections are very much a part of that.
Thank you, Donald. And of course now a question for Eve, that is the founding creator of Ensemble for the Romantic Century. And this is your sort of formula, magic formula, because by now you have written how many of these works?
I think we have written to date about 40 original productions.
And
I have written about 25, but I have a James Mello also writes scripts for the group, our musicologist.
And the idea behind them is that it's the theatrical concert. Maybe tell us something about what is this formula that incorporates acted theater at the highest level, music performed at the highest level, and to tell a story, normally of a person, normally of an artist.
Well, the way I look at it is that the music itself already tells a story. And
your training is in music.
Pianist,
You're a
yes.
pianist, yes.
So that already there's a narrative contained in this music, and there's a whole world contained in it. It's like you can feel the milieu of that time when you're listening to the music. When you're listening to a piece of Martucci, you're transported to a certain time period, certain feeling. So this combination of words and music is such that when you're listening to the music, the story advances within the music, as if it's part of the narrative. So it's an intertwining of musical narrative, in a sense, with spoken word.
And Eve, just to give a sense to the members of our audience that are not familiar with Ensemble for the Romantic Century, tell us some of the other titles that you guys have created together over the years.
Oh, well, we've done many different things. We did the Dreyfus Affair, which was at BAM, and Van Gogh's Year, Tolstoy's Last Days, a big piece about Peggy Guggenheim, Akhmatova, her meeting with Isaiah Berlin, Jules Verne meeting with Nellie Bly. I love that one. And
tell us what is coming.
They're not always composers or writers. Sometimes it's historical events or literature come to life.
Mhm. And tell us what is coming immediately after Toscanini.
After this, we're doing a piece about Hans Christian Andersen. I have to say the real story about Hans Christian Andersen, sort of his inner life, and it will be played by one actor playing 7 roles, countertenor, 2 pianists, and percussion, and puppets. So I do like to say that for each subject that we're inspired and passionate about treating, each one informs the way we do it. I would say that they're different ones. For example, when we did a piece about Tchaikovsky, there are people here who were at that show. There was no projection because it didn't call for it. It was a different sort of feeling that we wanted. And this time, though, there will be puppets. So it depends on the subject matter, how we treat the subject. For example, if it were to be Beethoven, I wouldn't give it this ultra multimedia projection treatment because it's so autobiographical, it's so internal, and the music is so complete. Some of this music, Castelnuovo Tedesco and the Martucci and Fano, are very cinematic, and in fact, Castelnuovo Tedesco, one of the composers in the Toscanini piece at the Duke, ended up being a Hollywood composer. So when you see it paired with the documentary film or the visual aspect, it works. The
Makes
important
total
thing
sense,
is it
yes.
has to work.
And before moving to John, I have another question for you. The focus in the show seems to be politics. There is a lot of
Yes.
politics. And from what we discussed with Harvey about his book, Toscanini was not a particularly political person himself. He didn't talk much about politics, but he had very few, very clear ideas about what was acceptable and tolerable and what was not. And he believed very strongly in those things. And what I loved in your piece, guys, is that it's a show that talks a lot about politics and the history of the time, but through the love letters.
Yes.
That was so brilliantly done, because it was not like through newspaper accounts or things that he would tell to his associates in the music business or otherwise. These are love letters, and he had a passionate love for these young pianists,
this
and
is
he
a-
cannot resist but talk about politics. Tell us
Yeah.
how you came about with these.
Well,
choice.
he wrote to Ada Minority, he had this affair with Ada Minority, who was a young pianist, and he wrote her over 1,000 love letters. And Harvey can tell you a lot more about that since he edited the book of her letters, of the letters that he wrote to her. Toscanini burned her letters, so we only have his letters to her. But besides being passionate, very erotic, I have to say also, and just incredibly fabulous letters, he talks a lot about politics to her. And one thing that's very interesting is that Ada was more fascist leaning, and this is a big thread in the show. I won't give it away.
And John, I have a question for you. First of all, I love the way in which you, and obviously with the direction of Don, approached Toscanini. He's such a larger-than-life figure.
Yes.
And there is so much footage also about him that is, on some level, it could be intimidating. But what I appreciated personally of your acting is that you were not impersonating Toscanini. You gave life to Toscanini in your own way. It was very easy maybe to fall in the temptation of imitate his accent, and you do not, and I'm very, very grateful for that. Truly, I mean, I've seen so many theatrical pieces ruined by the fact that an actor wants to imitate the accent that Toscanini had when he spoke English, obviously, was the accent of a person who learned English late in his life. But that would have distracted the attention of the people from the center, from the core of the issues that you discuss and narrate with the theatrical piece. So my question for you is, what is your, now that after you have been Toscanini for a while, and again for one more week, what is your assessment of him as a person? And what do you try to convey of this person to the audience?
Toscanini was, as you've said, I mean, he was probably the leading conductor of the 19th and 20th century, in my estimation. An astonishing man with an eidetic memory. He never carried the score, never looked at the score when he was conducting. Everything was memorized. This is covered in the thing. He compressed everything, memorized everything. And he knew hundreds of pieces in his mind. And his approach to music was of perfection. He was not interested in a musician taking an interpretation. He said, no, this man, this woman, has written this piece. These are the indicators that are there. Let us do them first. And he was really pedantic about that. And so occasionally, as you see in the play, he when he's conducting, he blasts the people all the time. And if you come to see it, that's going to be you, by the way. That's part of the fun of it. But he was very pedantic, and quite horrible in some ways. But the musicians loved him. Afterwards, when they were interviewed later on, they all spoke of him because he pushed them. He pushed them to their highest level, and that's a real. It's a compliment to him. It's a huge compliment. And too often we can just cruise through things, really. He said, nope, we're going here. And they went. And they were, in fact, amazing musicians all over the world, but at the NBC they were. So that's one aspect. I like that perfectionism in him. It's a gene that quite a few of us have, unfortunately. I loved the fact that, and this is an expression in the piece, that he was always striving to go somewhere that he couldn't get. He had even at the end of his life, he was still searching. And that, I think, many of us will identify with that too. You just keep on searching. And there's a lovely, lovely final epilogue that I have where he talks about that to the audience. He just, I won't give you the exact lines, but he's reaching. And I personally do understand that. You know, that sense of, there's still more. That's not the best I can do. There's still more. There's still more to do. I'd like that. I identified with it a lot. He was obsessive, and that's not an uncommon trait among these geniuses. I've actually had the good fortune to play a few geniuses types. There's that obsession, which can actually make them quite antisocial at times, as you probably know. There's probably a few of you in the room. But so he was a bit of an isolator, and he was rude to people, and he was unfaithful to his wife, and sometimes he was cruel to people. But there was a contradiction because he was also a family man. There's all sorts of contradictions about the man. I loved these elements about him, and the fact that he was able to maintain, and he never stopped working until the last couple of years of his life, and Harvey can help me here, when he had a little stroke. The man had this memory, and he forgot one thing, that's it. He said, that's it. And that was late, though. He was 87. Correct. And he worked all the time through there. He went to the NBC for 3 years and stayed 17. It's an indication. And he just introduced classical music to the Middle America like you wouldn't believe. Well, millions of people at the radios listening to Toscanini and the orchestra playing on a Saturday night or whatever. Isn't that amazing in this day and age? And they loved him. And he was a rock star. Those fellows were rock stars too. He wasn't the only one. And I loved so many aspects about him, and I could go on for a long time, but I won't. I'll let you have another question.
I'll get back to you, Jean, with another question. Harvey, you're probably the person alive that knows more about Toscanini.
Too much.
Including members of his family. Your book has just been also translated and published in Italy. And it seems even bigger. Or is it bigger, or is it because Italian is more lengthy as a language?
No, well, translations generally are longer than the versions in the original language. And in this case, some of the material, the reference material that I put online for the original English and American edition, they decided to print in the book. So that accounts for the extra pages.
And for those of you who were not here when we presented Harvey's book, Toscanini, Musician of Consciousness, the fundamental thing about this book is the sources that you were able to dig out. And some of the sources were archival sources or library sources, but some of them were sources that have been available only to you because they belong to the family. The letters are one of them, but then there were these incredible recordings that the son tricked him because with a device, with a standing lamp, if I remember correctly, and whenever there was a friend or a colleague visiting, Toscanini, first of all, refused to give interviews about himself. He said there was nothing interesting about his life. He didn't want to talk about himself, much less he wanted to write an autobiography. So whenever somebody would go to Riverdale and be with him, he loved talking and chatting with his friends and going back with memory to old times and not so old times. And the son, without telling him anything, recorded many, many, many hours of these conversations. And you were the first one that actually sat down, listened to them, transcribed them, and used them for your book. What are the things that you discovered from these specific sources that surprised you? Somebody like you who knew already a lot about Toscanini.
Well, what comes across in the conversations that you don't get from accounts of the public Toscanini, and even not so much from the letters, although occasionally in the letters, is the humor, the sense of humor, which is very lively in the conversations, and self-critical humor as well. I mean, he tells stories about himself that are anything but flattering to himself. The other, of course, amazing aspect of the conversations, which were recorded, the earliest ones were recorded when he was 86, and the last ones when he was 89, just a month or so before he died. What comes across to a great extent is this incredible memory that he still had, even at that age. Somebody would mention an orchestra player who had worked with him 60 years earlier, and he would tell you exactly how that person played, what he was like as a human being, did he drink too much, all this sort of thing. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of not only the music, which we take for granted, but of the people he worked with, the singers, which high note they could sing properly and which one they would add in, even though he told them not to do it, that sort of thing. So all of that comes across, the personality, the inner personality comes across very much, because in these conversations he was talking with family members and friends, and occasionally with orchestra people who would come out to visit him. So that's very, and why I had access to this is really Valfredo Toscanini, the grandson, the son of Toscanini's son, had kept these tapes. There were 100 of them. He lived in New Rochelle, and he had kept them in boxes under his bed for something like 40 years. And finally, when Arte and BBC decided to do a sort of docudrama about Toscanini in 2007, Valfredo decided, well, we have to have these transferred to digital files, and so he kept one copy for himself and he gave a copy to me, because Valfredo used to say, at this point, you are to my grandfather what the Pope is for Jesus Christ.
The vicar.
Vicar on earth, right? I don't know if that's good or bad, but
It's scary, though.
yes, it's frightening.
One more question for Don when it comes to the directing choices. We talked about how the play intersects love, politics, and music, obviously, because there are also the moments in which the maestro conducts the orchestra in this beautiful relationship that John is able to establish with the audience, as if you were a member of the orchestra. How do you interlace all these aspects, and is there any of these three that you think is more important or prevailing compared to the other two?
I think they take on a personality that begins with the author, in this case with Yves' exquisite understanding of what is of interest to people emotionally, personally, and then the facts, the historic facts. And Yves' work is like working with, I'd call it brocade. There's very fine threads of silk, and then there are very bold pieces. And I think the theater is often thought of as that serves lots of different other aspects of entertainment, but actually the theater is the theater. It is its own entity. And the goal is to create, I love it when old timers call a theater the room. The room. The room has this feeling, or the room has that feeling. And what I think we try to do is to create a room in which the truthful elements, the beauty of the music, the beauty of the projections, and John is the example of the perfection of acting as its own kind of medium, through which we cannot really understand anything without the freedom of the actor. And so for me, it's the joy of keeping all these pieces active and making a room, to make a room where you want to be, and you gradually feel the audience live in that room, and they get used to it, and it becomes something that is not pushing something at you, it is there.
Great answer, thank you. I don't want to monopolize the conversation, even if it could go on forever, and I would like to open, yes?
I just want to express my appreciation for the wonderful, edifying homage. I learned so much from this production, and it was so wonderfully put together, and I especially liked the audio-visual about the Palestine Orchestra, about the St. Louis ship, and it was so beautifully organized and presented, and I want to thank you for the most rewarding experience.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And maybe, Harvey, you want to say something about the Palestine Orchestra, since I mentioned it in my introduction, but we might as well say something more precise about it.
Well, in 1936, of course, Toscanini had already, he was already well known for his anti-fascism. He had been beaten up by fascist hooligans in 1931 in Bologna for refusing to perform the party anthem. And in 1933, when Hitler came to power, he refused to return to the Bayreuth Festival, the Wagner Festival, where he had been totally idolized in the 1930 and 31 festivals. So, and he, although, as Stefano mentioned before, he was not a politician. He wasn't interested in party politics, but he had his way of thinking. And in 1936, the Polish violinist Bronisław Huberman, a Polish Jew who was one of the best-known violinists of his time, sent Toscanini a letter saying, I have an idea that I'm obsessed with, and I want to talk to you about it. And they were both in New York at the time, and Toscanini, of course, agreed to see him. And the idea was to create an orchestra in Palestine made up of mostly, almost entirely, of Jewish refugees from Central Europe, from Germany and elsewhere, from other countries where they felt things were about to happen. And so he asked Toscanini if he would give his moral support to the idea, and Toscanini said, not only that, I will go there at my own expense and conduct the inaugural concerts. And so that was how that all came to be. And of course, he was very much admired for having done that. Albert Einstein, among others, wrote him a thank you letter full of praise for what he had done. So, this was one of the many, many manifestations. You know the phrase, put your money where your mouth is. It wasn't just, yes, I'm an anti-fascist. No, he really did what he believed in.
And that was like a slap in the face of Mussolini, that the most famous Italian ever would do something so challenging of him.
Well, and also when he went back in 1938 for the second season to conduct again the Palestine Orchestra, that was the same year in which the fascist government passed its anti-Semitic racial laws. And so it was, this contrast. And of course, Toscanini, later in 1938, the fascist government took his passport away when he was in Italy because they had intercepted a telephone conversation. They did wiretapping even then, in which, with Ada Mainardi, in which he referred to the new racial laws as medieval stuff. And when this was reported to Mussolini, he ordered that they take Toscanini's passport away.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Yes.
Eve, can you talk a bit about your selection process for the music and
Yes. Well, in this piece, I have threaded through it. I think this piece conceptually is also about the relationship between recording and live music. So we do have actual Toscanini rehearsal recordings, and it's really wonderful to hear them. And those are of his rehearsals and performances of Aida. And that's a political story as well. So this threads through. And then the other composer, the music isn't haphazardly chosen. You have Castelnuovo Tedesco, a composer. He helped come to the United States because he was a Jewish composer, and he helped him escape. And Harvey can tell you more details about exactly how he did that. He also gave him money. There was Martucci, who he knew, and also he was beaten up at the Martucci commemoration because he wouldn't play the fascist national anthem. Yes? And there's Wagner, because we have it blend from the recorded to the live, a fabulous performance by the pianist you heard today of the Liebestod, because first of all, he was very famous for conducting it, and for me it also represents this big discussion about Wagner and anti-Semitism as well, and provides a contrast. And then we have the Respighi pieces. He also knew Respighi, and some of the composers are also fascist-leaning, and this is a very interesting discussion because, as in France, and this was true when we did the Dreyfus Affair, the composers went into different camps. In fact, Harvey wrote a book about that too, about music in fascist Italy. Some of the composers were searching for the Italian Aryan roots, like Respighi, like the Pines of Rome, going back to their ancient roots and finding their pure music. The French did it as well, going back to Rameau and Couperin. And in Italy, they went back to the antiche danze and that sort of thing. So there's this conflict in the music between the Jewish composers like Fano, who was in hiding during the war, Finzi, who was also under attack and was in Milan. He was a Jewish composer. Fano ended up being hidden in a convent or a monastery, and for the whole war, and later converted to Catholicism. And you hear a kind of a Catholic strain in his music. There's a chorale section. I love this part of the piece because during that chorale, you see the paratroopers dropping in southern Italy. It's absolutely beautiful. So the music is all intertwined with the people Toscanini helped, the whole issue of the Jewish composers, refugee composers, as well as Verdi, and the political aspect of the Risorgimento, in fact. It's all wrapped in there. Because really this is a political piece.
Indeed it is. Yes.
Without a passport, how did Toscanini get out of Europe?
It's a long story.
It is a long story, but I'll make it as short as possible. Actually, he had his passport taken away twice. The first time in 1931 after the incident in Bologna where he was physically attacked. But then, they gave it back to him after about a month. But from then on, whenever he was in Italy, his mail was opened, people who came to visit him, it was, notes were made by the, people stood outside his door, fascist spies or informers, and, kept tabs on everything, and wiretaps and so on. In 1938, after the incident that I mentioned before, when his passport was taken away for having said that the anti-Semitic laws were medieval stuff, roba da medioevo, in a phone conversation. And also, Mussolini was very upset because Maria José, who was the crown princess, the consort of Crown Prince Umberto, had gone to hear Toscanini in Lucerne, which was his last stand in Europe after he had given up Bayreuth and Salzburg in Italy and every place else. His last stand was the Lucerne Festival, which he helped to create in 1938. He conducted a couple of concerts in 38, and Maria José went to attend the concert, and so did a number of important fascists, and Mussolini was really angry about that. Anyway, they took his passport away when he came back, and Mussolini said, if he asks for it, I'll give it back to him. Well, of course, Toscanini would not ask Mussolini for a favor. So there was back and forth, and finally Toscanini's son, Walter, was a friend of a Swiss journalist, and he managed to tip him off about what was happening. And the journalist went very sort of innocently to ask in Rome, there are rumors about Toscanini's passport having been taken away, and he's under house arrest, and so on. And Mussolini, was a journalist to start with, and he cared a lot about image. And so at that point, he decided, give back the passport. I don't want to deal with this anymore. So they did. And he came to New York later than he was supposed to have arrived for his second NBC season in the fall of 38. And when he went onto the stage at Rockefeller Center for his first rehearsal, the orchestra gave him a 10-minute ovation for what he had done, what he had been through.
And Harvey, but he never wanted to give up his Italian citizenship.
That's
he
correct.
He could have had American citizenship.
Absolutely. And his son and younger daughter both became American citizens. But he wanted to, he was Italian to the core, and he would never have thought of giving. I suppose if the fascists had won the war, perhaps eventually he might have become a U.S. citizen. But under the circumstances, no, not at all.
Thank you. Yes? If you can wait for the microphone, it's right there. Thank you.
Yeah, there was a particular performance of the Verdi Requiem that had to do with him against these political things. I was just wondering, because I had a film of it from many years ago, black and white, of course, but I was just wondering if you know anything about that particular Verdi Requiem performance.
Yes.
It was either against the fascists or, or what he stood for in the regard that you're speaking of politically.
Right. It's not actually the Verdi Requiem. It's the Hymn of the Nations, which he recorded, which he filmed and recorded. It's a piece that Verdi wrote in 1862, and it combines the national anthems of Britain and France, which had helped Italy in the Risorgimento, and the Italian national anthem. And then Toscanini in 1943 he edited the score, and he added the Soviet, what was then or had been the Soviet anthem, the Socialist International, and the Star-Spangled Banner to represent the other two big allies against Germany and the fascist powers, Nazi powers. So that was the film. It was a half-hour film that was made. He contributed his services gratis. Was made for the Office of War Information here in the States, and the orchestra musicians also contributed their services.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Oh, hi. Can you speak about Toscanini at the Embassy Studios and complaining always about the quality of the sound? And how many of those sessions or transmissions are made from Carnegie Hall at his insistence?
Actually, he didn't insist about that. There was an aspect of the sound in Studio 8H which was terribly dry, but there was an aspect of it that he rather liked because the sound from where he stood on the podium was very clear. And then after the first 2 or 3 seasons, they made some improvements in the acoustics. For us today, those of us who never heard him live, which is just about everybody nowadays, the sound of the recordings from Studio 8H is really very antipatico. You know, it's not. It's a dry as dust sound. The performances, when the NBC Symphony gave benefit performances, for instance, at Carnegie Hall, and those were recorded, the sound is so much better. It's so much more alive. But that's what there is. And from 1950, when Studio 8H was turned into a television studio, all of the NBC concerts for Toscanini's last 4 seasons were in Carnegie Hall.
Yes.
After 1946, Thank you. After 1946, did Toscanini navigate the impending Cold War with discretion and invisibility politically, given that Italy had a far different experience in terms of the politics of that period than the very Cold Warrior United States? Was he discreet, or did he evidence any kind of political identifications with the clashes that were beginning to emerge in the late 40s through 50s?
No, he remained apolitical at that point. I mean, I know his daughter told me that he always, in Italy after the war, he always voted for the Social Democrats. But he certainly was not pro-communist. He felt that he had felt that FDR was a little bit too far to the right for him. But okay. After that, I mean, also because, you know, in 47 he turned 80, he really was kind of removed from it all, and he was very happy that Italy was free, that people were free to vote for whoever they wanted to vote for. You know, he was not a practicing Catholic, so he didn't like the Christian Democrats very much in Italy, but, you know, he stayed completely out of it. In 1949, the president of Italy, Luigi Einaudi, offered him a senatorship, a life senatorship, and he turned it down, not to insult anybody, but because he just wanted to continue working as long as he could, and he felt that if he accepted an honor like that, he'd want to be in Rome all the time and sitting in Parliament, which would have bored him to death. So,
but we would have had some nice show in that Senate.
possibly.
Yes.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for the wonderful play which I saw today. I was very impressed by absolutely everything. My question is, I heard in one interview by Riccardo Muti that he mentioned that Toscanini had the bloody rival in Italy who was conductor as well. Who was this conductor? As far as I tried to search it, I could not find, but he mentioned, Muti himself, that this conductor that was a rival with Toscanini was Muti's one of the teachers. Vittoria, and the last name, I could not get it.
No, Muti's teacher was Antonino Votto.
I know also, but he mentioned two. He mentioned the second one.
That's the only teacher of his I know about. Votto had been one of Toscanini's assistants at La Scala, and then he went on to have a conducting career of his own. But he may have been somebody like Antonio Guarnieri, you know, who hated Toscanini. I mean, there were a lot of other conductors who disliked him because he had a career that was far beyond anybody else's.
Yeah, but
a rival, I mean, no, Furtwängler was German. If you're talking about Italian conductors,
Italian, yes.
you know, they almost all.
Vittoria.
Victor de Sabata. Toscanini. De Sabata was a wonderful musician, a great conductor.
You're right.
You know, when you.
Thank you so much.
No, yeah. If you deal with famous artists, you know that if somebody has a very strong point of view, he or she is not going to like the other people who conduct or perform the same pieces that they perform because they have very strong ideas about what they want. So,
just about conductor rivals, Toscanini did write a bit about Furtwängler but this was a political question. He was extremely critical of his conducting also, but he really was, he respected him, but he did not respect that he stayed in Germany. And if any of you have seen it, or you can really go on YouTube and see this, Furtwängler conducting Beethoven's Ninth for Hitler's birthday under a swastika. That's the kind of thing Toscanini would never pardon, would never forgive.
Thank you so much.
And you might want to say what he said about art and politics.
Well, what's interesting about the Toscanini-Furtwängler story, which is extremely long and complicated, is that they both started from the same point of view, that art and politics should not mix. Furtwängler's take was, I do what I have to do to keep the art, the music, going. Toscanini's point of view was, there are certain conditions under which you can't do that. You have to make a choice. That was the basic difference.
And my question is now for all of you as artists in your own right, and it's exactly regarding this. He was not a politician, he was not political, but in extreme circumstances, his principles were so strong that he took a very open political stance. When do you think that moment comes for an artist like you, for a director, an actor, an author, to take a very strong and open political stance? Is there a moment in which you as artists are asked to do something like that?
Well, I think we'd like to know when that moment comes. we
may be coming.
Yeah, we sort of, as Delmore Schwartz said, even paranoids have enemies. You know, I mean, if you follow the Toscanini story and the wonderful saga of the passports and his escape, actually, and being held in, in a shed with Carla while they phoned Mussolini's office to see whether or not he should be let through. I think certainly our history as artists is that artists usually are, I'd like to say we do carry the seeds of rebellion and resistance. We probably have a slightly more open conversation at this moment, although I'm not sure it's more open than it was in the 1930s in Italy. But so I think most artists, certainly I do, feel that we're always involved in having certainly reactions, and then however those reactions can take shape, in art. Very little great art is not political.
Thank you.
It's a matter of waiting, isn't it? Reflecting, Penny and my wife and I have been talking about the current situation in this country, which is when this play came along, one of the attractions for me was the content, and I thought this is incredibly timely. It just came at us. I didn't go looking for it, but it came, and I feel when I'm doing this character, I feel that there's a message there that we should all listen to, and that's political for me as an artist. I've never enjoyed didactic theatre ever, and I ran a theatre company for many years, and the opposition wanted to do the didactic stuff back in the 70s, but I thought, no, I didn't want that. Play to the converted. So for me, it's a matter of waiting, but certainly having principles, your own principles that you carry through. But you can't go out there and change the world. You can change little bits. All of us can do that, little bits. And that way that builds up, and maybe we hit a tipping point. That's what we're hoping, isn't it, Penny? Waiting for the tipping point before we shuffle off the mortal coil. It might happen. Thank you.
You as an artist and as an author, you make a lot of decisions.
So the question is, at what point do you feel that you're taking a risk, sort of?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that I would compromise my artistic vision. I'm saying the negative of this. Like, I don't think I would soften the blow of what some of these things mean to accommodate. So I like to think that I'm brave a little bit, you know. And I agree with John. It's, you know, you can't change the world, but for example, I have met some young people who didn't know who Goebbels was, and things like that make me realize that we all have to educate as well. And Toscanini could fade from memory easily, and for me, he's a very inspiring figure politically, I mean musically, absolutely, but also I just feel that he's, for our times, is a very inspiring figure. He stood up against basic anti-Semitism especially, but racism in a sense, and he really stood up to Hitler directly, and Mussolini. He even wrote to Hitler, and when he withdrew from Bayreuth, that was a major statement, for example. So I would like to have, I mean, the thing is that Toscanini had a lot of power in the sense that he was a rock star, as John had said, and he really was a rock star, like what we would consider today. So I would like to think that anyone who has more voice or power can be part of this chain of resistance, but also of educating the next generation. And we did a show about Van Gogh. This may not seem related, but in it he said, he very modestly, because he never sold a painting, Van Gogh said, "I am just an artist in a chain of artists," which is very moving. And I just feel like we all can contribute our bit, but for me it's about not compromising ever, actually, artistically. Like, I don't want to take out a fact or a line if it's uncomfortable. I want to leave it in. It's that simple. And maybe Harvey wants to talk about that too, about not compromising.
Well, no, I mean, you know, as you said, I mean, Toscanini had the advantage of being so famous that the fascists were leery about touching him, you know. And as I've said many times, if he had been in Germany, they would have done away with him. Mussolini, being a journalist, was afraid to touch such a famous person. Probably after himself, Toscanini was the most famous person in Italy at that time. And so, you know, it's a whole different situation for people who are, you know, working in the arts but not world famous figures. It's much more difficult. And this is it's a quandary that one faces. You know, we're not in a situation now where we're not allowed to say what we think about the powers that be. If that were to happen, then you know, the situation degenerates, shall we say.
Is there any other question from you? Yes.
It's a provocation. You know, the director Albertini wrote in on La Voce di New York, you know, the polemics about Columbus Day, and if she should, then he did that I think it was a very good one, because he said, well, I am for a Toscanini Day. Why in America they don't do that? But here there is a question here is important. My question is, why Toscanini didn't stick in the mind, for example, of Italian Americans? He has all the qualities for a hero. In an artistic way, for sure, but also as a man that was on the right side at the right time. So, what is the idea? Why in America in general, but I mean, I'm talking about why it is not only provocation, should be done more for the people here of Italian origin to make Toscanini a symbol of heroism. Don't you think that?
Great idea.
Well, yeah, the problem is, of course, you know, Toscanini was a conductor. He was a performing musician. He was not a creative musician. He always said, I'm not a genius. You know, the geniuses are the ones who create. And so Rossini and Verdi and, you know, just to name a couple of well-known Italian musicians, their names live on. a performing musician, even if in his lifetime, in this case, he sold more records and was more fit. And you know, in the Time magazine in 1934 said 9 million Americans listened to his radio broadcasts every week. That was 7% of the entire population of the United States in those days. But, you know, a generation after he stopped conducting, the recordings, the sound isn't up to date, it's not super digital, hyper, whatever, and so the recordings aren't listened to except by specialists. And this is the fate of the performing musician. I think of Herbert von Karajan, who had everything he did in his last 20 years recorded, filmed, every time he sneezed, practically. And now, 30 years after his death, he's in the remainders bin like all the others, you know. So it's the question is that this was not a creative person. This was a reproductive, a performing artist. And so the name doesn't last. I think that's probably what it is.
Thank you. But I think also that's the important reason why in the play you emphasize this idea of his convictions, of his personality, of his principles, because these are the things that last and that could still make him that symbol in which we all should or could recognize ourselves or aspire to be just a little bit at least like him. And without any other, if there is no, yes, last question there, and then we go to a closing.
They don't teach music at all in the schools. They don't know who Beethoven is. I mean, you know.
Yes, music education as part of a more general curriculum, of a whole curriculum. Well, I think this was a fantastic evening. Thank you very much to all of you. The author of Maestro and the creative director of the Ensemble for the Romantic Center, Yves Wolf, the vicar of Toscanini on Earth, Harvey Sachs, Toscanini at the Duke, John Noble, and the director that put it all together, here to my right, Donald Sanders. Thank you.